I'm Gina, and I'm here with Deanna, and we're going to be talking about the future of renewable energy. So we'll cover a few renewable energy topics, the pros and cons of them, where they're used, and new developments, things like that. And then you'll be able to kind of compare them all and see the different options for our renewable energy future. So it should be exciting. To start us off, I'm going to be talking about wind energy. So wind energy, it uses turbines that capture the kinetic energy of the Earth's natural airflow. And for those who don't know, kinetic energy is energy of motion. So as you can see, there's a wind farm there in that photo. A little bit about wind energy is that wind is caused by the uneven heating of the atmosphere by the sun. So technically, wind is actually a form of solar energy. And other things that cause it are the rotation of the Earth and irregularities on Earth's surface. It is also one of the oldest forms of renewable energy. There have been uses for wind energy for over thousands of years, and it's used by things like the sails of ships or by windmills that were originally used to grind grain or to drop water from wells. So you can see an example of that in the photo over here on the left. That is an old wind pump from the 1800s that used water, that drew water from the ground for a town in South Dakota. So as you can see, it's been used for a really long time. There are three types of wind energy. The first one that we'll talk about is utility scale wind energy. And that is basically the classic wind farm that you would see if you're driving around, and you can see it in the hills. It's really big wind turbines, and there's usually a lot of them, and they create energy and send that to the grid. So that would be utility scale. And the second type is offshore wind, which is exactly as it sounds. It's turbines that are in the water, as you can see in this photo over here. And the offshore wind turbines are usually bigger than the turbines on land, since there is more space to have larger turbines. And finally, the third form of wind energy is called distributed or small wind. And that is smaller wind turbines, and it's usually only one or two of them. And they're used, instead of sending energy to the electric grid, it's used to directly power a individual home or farm or business or school. So those are the three types of wind energy, and we will get more into how they work now. So here we're going to be talking about the different types of turbines. You can see in this diagram over here how a wind turbine works. So when the wind comes to the turbine, it spins the blades of the turbine, and that in turn will spin a shaft, which is connected to a generator, and that produces electricity. It's kind of a simplified version of it, but that is how they work. And then that electricity, if it is a utility scale wind farm, will go out into the power grid. So there are two different types of wind turbines. One is called a horizontal axis turbine. And as you can see in this photo right here, they're the classic wind turbine that you would see. It's what you're used to seeing. Most of the wind turbines are horizontal axis, and that is because horizontal axis are more efficient than vertical axis. And these horizontal axis turbines, it's a little counterintuitive because the towers are not horizontal, but the reason why it's called horizontal is because that shaft that's inside the turbine is parallel to the earth and horizontal. And for vertical wind turbines, that shaft is going up and down, and that's why it's called a vertical axis wind turbine. And you can see two different types there of the vertical axis turbines. They have been used for a really long time, for over a century, but there's very few in use today because, as I said, they're not as effective as the horizontal wind turbines. They do have different advantages to horizontal wind turbines, but as I'll talk about later, they need a lot of improvement to be able to compete with horizontal axis. So next we'll talk about where wind energy is used. And Obviously, turbines are generally more effective in places that have a lot of wind, where wind is fast. So that's often in higher elevations, like on the tops of hills, but it can also be in plains where there's no obstructions to the wind. And so the wind will blow quicker across the plains where there's no trees or hills or things like that. And also on bodies of water, as used in offshore wind, there's a lot of wind over lakes or oceans. And finally, you can put turbines in gaps between mountains because the mountains will funnel the air through quicker. So those are some locations that generally have wind turbines. As for what places around the world use wind energy a lot, the United States is actually second in wind power generation in the world, right after China. However, we only use our energy in total only gets 7% from wind. So we do make a lot of it compared to other places, but it doesn't account for a big percentage of our energy yet. And inside the United States, Texas is the state that uses the most electricity from wind. It gets about 24% of its power from wind. And we in California are fifth on that list. We get about 7% of our energy from wind. Another country that uses a lot of wind energy is Denmark. They get the highest proportion of their energy from wind power in the world at 43%. Pretty impressive. So you can also see in this photo, this graph is shows you where the utility scale wind electricity is used in the US. So as you can see, Texas uses a lot, and other states, including California, do as well. So utility scale wind, those really big wind farms with big turbines, are used in 42 states. And distributed wind, where it would be one or maybe two turbines used to power individual buildings, is used in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam. So it's used all across the country. And offshore wind is actually only used in one spot so far. That picture that I showed you earlier was of our one offshore wind farm in the US at Block Island, Rhode Island. So there is probably going to be more offshore wind in the future, but for now we only have one offshore wind farm. Next, we'll cover a little bit of the pros and cons of wind energy. So some pros is that there are no emissions from the actual generation of power from the wind turbines. There are obviously some emissions with creating and building the wind turbines, but once they're up and running, there are no emissions from creating that power. It is also one of the cheapest forms of energy because it doesn't take very expensive materials to create those wind turbines. And once they are made, they require little maintenance and they will last for decades to create energy. Another pro is that it doesn't take up much ground space. So while they are very tall, the actual base of the wind turbine is not as big as you would need a lot of space for other electricity generations. Like, for example, solar takes up a lot of space and wind would not take up as much space as that. So that's another pro. There are, however, some cons related to wind energy, as there are with anything. And that one of them is that the sites of wind farms are often far away from the cities that require the most power. And so that makes us have to build more transmission lines and power lines to take that energy from the wind farm to the city. There is also obviously an impact on local wildlife. It will take up and alter some habitat of different wildlife. And as you've probably heard, birds and bats can be killed by flying into the blades of wind turbines. Although I will give you a stat here that I found is that it's the estimated annual bird mortality rates for collisions with wind turbines is about 10 times less than collisions from communications and other towers, about 1,000 times less than from collisions with power lines, and 1,000 to 10,000 times less from collisions with buildings. So while it does contribute to bird mortality, it is a much smaller factor than many other man-made things. So that is something to think about. A final con is that they cause some noise and aesthetic pollution, as they're often built in really beautiful rural areas around the country. It can often ruin the scenery in that area. And also noise pollution, which is caused by the turbines, causes bad effects for humans as well as wildlife. So those are some of the pros and cons of wind energy. There are some good things and some bad things. Finally, we'll talk about some new developments that are occurring in the industry. So first of all, obviously, as things continue to be developed, new components and prototypes are always improving, and that is leading to better efficiency, capacity, reliability, and a lower cost of wind turbines. It is constantly improving. Another thing that researchers are trying to develop is reducing harm to birds and bats, like I was talking about. There are many ways to do this. One of those is having new designs for wind turbines. For example, having taller turbines so that they're not in the way of birds, or having shorter blades so that the area swept out by the turbine is not so big that it will cause more harm to birds. Another way that they're reducing harm to birds and bats is finding better places to put the wind farms. So if you put the wind farms in locations that are away from important bird areas, such as wetlands or ridge edges, and especially migratory flight paths of endangered birds, then that can do a lot to help the birds, just if you put the wind farm in a different location. Finally, there are a lot of other strategies that are being researched to help this. Some of them include having ultrasonic boom boxes on the wind turbine that will send out a sound that will kind of warn away any birds or bats that are coming near. Another strategy is making the wind turbines different colors so that it won't attract the bird prey, which will in turn attract birds. And a third way to do this is ultraviolet light. If they have ultraviolet light on the turbines, it will often do the same thing and warn away birds or bats from coming towards the turbines. So those are some ways that they're trying to reduce harm to birds and bats. Another thing that is occurring in the industry is trying to improve vertical axis turbines. So like I said, they're not as efficient as horizontal axis turbines. So researchers are trying to increase the efficiency, the reliability, and to decrease the cost of vertical axis turbines, since they do have some benefits. For example, when they are near each other, they will increase the wind flow for the wind turbines that are downwind, which is something that horizontal axis turbines don't do. And so because of this, you could potentially produce more power from the same area of vertical axis turbines than horizontal axis turbines. Another thing is that offshore wind is getting a lot of attention recently. It has a lot of potential. It has the potential to generate over 2,000 gigawatts per year, which is almost double the nation's energy use. That's according to the Department of Energy. So there's a lot of potential there for offshore wind. And so a lot of states, especially across the northern seaboard, are trying to establish more offshore wind farms. For example, in Maine, they are experimenting with floating wind energy technology, which will allow for more deep water projects since they won't have to be rooted into the ground, they can just be floating. Finally, something that I think is really impressive is there is a new prototype for a wind turbine called the Haliade X, and that is from General Electric, and it is a really, really big turbine. It's the biggest in the industry so far. It is 850 feet tall, and one of these turbines can power up to 16,000 homes. It also generates 40% more power than any other turbine in the US industry. And so if you look at this photo up here in the right, it shows you just how big this turbine is. As you can see, it's bigger than the other turbines that we have. It is over twice the size of the Statue of Liberty. It is just 200 feet shy of the Eiffel Tower and over half the size of the Empire State Building. So it is a really big wind turbine that generates a lot of energy. Okay, so that is the new developments for wind energy, and that is going to conclude our discussion of wind energy, and I will turn it over to Deanna to talk a little bit about hydroelectricity.
Hi, I'm Deanna. It's nice to meet everyone. So hydroelectricity captures energy from moving water. And here we have a photo of a dam, which we'll later learn more about. So hydroelectricity is one of the oldest and most popular forms of renewable energy. In the United States, it accounts for about 6.5% of all electricity generation and about 38% of all renewable energy generation, making it the most popular form of renewable energy. However, the production is decreasing because society is starting to embrace other forms. Oh, thank you. Because society is starting to embrace other forms of energy like wind, solar, and geothermal, all of which we'll get into more further along in our happy hour. And as Southern Californians, we might be wondering how something that relies on water is renewable. And it's renewable because hydropower uses the water cycle to naturally replenish itself and works best in areas that receive a little bit more precipitation than we do here. Below we have a diagram of the water cycle, and it describes how the sun unevenly heats rivers, lakes, and the ocean until the water eventually will evaporate. And once this water evaporates, it will rise to the sky and cool down to form clouds. Once these clouds are heavy enough, they will rain or snow, and that runoff will collect in the rivers, streams, lakes, and oceans, and eventually continue the cycle. So at hydroelectric facilities, falling water will spin a turbine inside of a generator, and shown in the picture on the bottom right, the orange turbine at the bottom of the diagram, which you can see to scale, there's a tiny little human next to it. It's very huge, and it's propelled by water, and that spins the generator, creating electricity. So now we'll talk about conventional hydroelectric facilities. And these facilities do not require additional energy to move water because they utilize the natural flow of the water's current. They also may or may not store water in a dam. Some of the advantages to storing water is that it can be controlled more easily and can start up faster than non-renewable energy sources. But only about 3% of all dams are actually used to generate electricity. Some of the other uses are for just like municipal needs and just to prevent droughts. So in the top photo, we have a picture of a diversion or run-of-river facility. These do not store water, and they're mainly used for baseload capacity needs. At the bottom, we have an impoundment facility, which stores water in a dam or reservoir and is more flexible and can be used during peak capacity. The picture is actually of the Hoover Dam. Next, we have the pump storage facilities, which pump water uphill when demand and electricity costs are low, which is usually at nighttime, and then they'll release that water during peak hours, usually during the day because more people like to use electricity during the daytime. These facilities are usually smaller and reuse the same water multiple times and are very adaptable. However, they are not as energy efficient as conventional facilities, but they can be powered with other renewable sources of energy. And now we have tidal power. Tides are very easy to predict and track because they are influenced by the gravitational pull of the moon and the rotation of the earth. Tidal power is a bit newer than all the other forms of hydroelectricity that we've been speaking about, but and because of that, the USA doesn't currently have any operating commercial facilities, but lots of research has been done to kind of stake out viable areas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for now, the three main types of tidal power are barrages, turbines, and fences. And as shown in the photo, the turbine resembles a wind turbine. However, water is a lot denser than air, so these turbines need to be built with more durable materials and are actually able to produce more energy with the same size turbine. So in the United States, the majority of hydroelectricity is produced in Washington, California, New York, and Oregon. This photo shows conventional hydroelectricity generation in each state. And just a reminder, the conventional electricity generation includes like the dams or run-of-river facilities. So now we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages to using hydroelectricity. Some of the pros are that hydroelectricity is an affordable source of renewable energy, and also during operation, it is not a direct source of pollution. Oftentimes, any emissions that were created during the construction of these facilities are offset by the lifespan. They have a pretty long lifespan and they're able to be operated from anywhere between 50 to 100 years. And lastly, these systems are very adaptable to changes in energy consumption. And so hydroelectricity can be produced quicker than some forms of non-renewable energy. This makes it ideal to pair with solar or wind energy because it can accommodate for an increase in demand of electricity. However, some of the downsides include that it alters the water sources, which can lead to habitat loss or even modification in and around the watersheds. Dams are specifically known for impacting fish migration, and people are often concerned about salmon populations passing through. Additionally, dams and reservoirs require a considerable amount of land. They're also very expensive to build and have the potential to displace not only human but non-human communities like plants and animals. Storing water in dams and or reservoirs can also change the physical characteristics of the water, which has rippling effects on the ecosystem. It can lead to a buildup in the amount of rock, sand, or silt in the water, which inhibits natural geologic processes and may disrupt animals or plants at the bottom of the water. Also, it can change the temperature of the water, which may increase how quickly minerals dissolve and the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. All of these factors can add stress to the ecosystem. So some new developments aim to kind of mitigate these negative effects. For example, the US Department of Energy has stated that they favor the use of pump storage facilities because they are smaller and more responsive to consumers' needs. Also, tidal energy is expected to become more popular in America. Studies have been done to show or to find areas that have the most tidal potential. I think somewhere in, I don't remember the exact city, but somewhere in Alaska and parts of Maine are seeming like good contenders for this. And then lastly, I think this one's the most exciting. The largest dam removal in the United States occurred within the last decade. This marks a turning point in how our society views our relationship with nature. And I personally think that we are starting to understand the impacts of our actions and kind of that impact that we can have on the natural world. And we're finding more sustainable ways to fuel our lifestyles. The photo here shows the river following the removal of the Glines Canyon Dam in Washington, and many people consider this to be a success story because there has been an increase in wildlife and nature is ultimately reclaiming the land.
I'm going to talk now about geothermal energy. And geothermal energy harnesses the natural heat and thermal energy from below the surface of the Earth. And you can see a picture of a geothermal power plant right here. So a little bit about geothermal is that the word geothermal comes from the words for earth, geo, and heat, thermal, so heat from the earth. And the reservoirs of geothermal energy, like hot springs, have been used for a really long time. For example, by ancient Roman, Chinese, and Native American cultures, they were used for bathing, cooking, and heating. So the idea of using this geothermal power has been there for a really long time, but only recently have we started to actually use it to make electricity. So there are three types of geothermal energy systems. The first one is called direct use and district heating. And so this would use the hot water from springs or reservoirs that are located near the surface of the earth. And they would that water would be piped into buildings to heat it. So it can either be used for an individual building or for communities. For example, in Reykjavik, Iceland, a district heating system provides heat for most of the buildings there. So that is direct use, where they're using reservoirs close to the surface and piping the water directly to buildings. The second way that we use geothermal energy is geothermal power plants, which I will talk about a little bit more later. But it is using the reservoirs from deeper in the earth to create electricity. And the third way that we use geothermal energy is with geothermal heat pumps. And these are, they don't use a reservoir of geothermal water or steam and things like that under the earth. Instead, they use just the constant temperature of the upper part of the Earth's crust. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. Geothermal heat pumps, which are also called ground source heat pumps sometimes, like I said, they're used to heat and cool these individual houses or buildings, but they're not using a reservoir from underground like the other types of geothermal energy. So the process is shown in this graph over here, this little diagram. Basically, it can heat and cool houses. So when it's trying to keep a house warm, what happens is it sends colder water down into the earth, where that like upper about 10 feet of earth generally maintains a constant temperature. So when that water is piped down into the ground, it gets warmed up by the ground around it. And it can be then sent back up into the house, where it can be sent around to warm the house. It can be used for space or water heating. So that is how a ground source heat pump or a geothermal heat pump would warm a house. And then it can also cool down a house in the summer. And so this process is a little bit more confusing, but basically what happens is there is water in the heat pump that absorbs the heat from the air around it in the house. And then that water is sent down into the earth, where again, it's kind of that same constant temperature. So it releases the heat into the ground and cools down. And that cool energy can be piped back into the house, and it is there to absorb the heat again. So just like when you hold, a cold water bottle or cup of water, and your hands become cold as that cup sort of absorbs the heat from your hand, it acts in that same way, this geothermal heat pump, where it takes the heat out of the air from around the house, and then it disperses it down into the ground and takes the warmth from in the ground and takes it, it cools down in the ground and takes it back up to the house. So that is a geothermal heat pump. Another way that we use geothermal energy is generating electricity at geothermal power plants. So over here in these photos, I have pictures of the different types of power plants. They all use underground reservoirs of hot water or steam to make electricity. So there are three different types as shown here. The first one is called a dry steam plant, and that is the oldest geothermal technology. It takes steam out of the fractures in the ground, and it uses that steam to drive a turbine, just like any of the other turbines that we've seen so far in the presentation, that will spin the turbine and turn the shaft, which creates electricity in the generator. And once that is done, that steam is brought down and condensed into water and sent back down to replenish the geothermal reservoir. So that's a dry steam plant. The second type of geothermal power plant is a flash plant or a flash steam plant. And this will not just pull steam from this reservoir, but it will pull hot water as well. And so when that hot water is brought up into this area with cooler water with lower pressure, it will create steam from that as the two interact. And that steam is sent up again, just like before, to turn a turbine and create energy. And then that water and steam comes down, the steam is condensed, and it is sent again back into the reservoir. And the final type of geothermal power plant is a binary power plant. And these actually never vaporize the liquid from the reservoir. So what happens is it brings the hot water up, and it is used to heat a secondary fluid. And this fluid can be water, but it is usually a fluid that has a lower boiling point than water, so that it more easily becomes steam to spin that turbine. So it never actually makes the liquid from in the geothermal reservoir into steam, and it just keeps it liquid the whole time and sends it back down. So there's kind of two closed loops there. And in the future, all of most of our geothermal power plants will be binary power plants. This has been found to be the best type of geothermal power plants because with that, when you don't vaporize that liquid, it isn't vaporizing any other minerals or any toxic substances that may be in the ground. So it would minimize any pollution that may occur. So those are the different types of geothermal power plants. And we will talk now about where geothermal energy is used. So obviously it depends what type of geothermal system we are talking about. If it is a heat pump, it can be used anywhere since it's just using that top portion of the earth and not an actual reservoir. The power plants, however, have to be in volcanically and tectonically active regions. So it is restricted on where those power plants can be set up. In the world, the United States produces the most geothermal energy, although it is not very much because it is still kind of a new renewable source. So it only accounts for about 0.5% of our electricity generation, but we do produce the most in the world. In the United States, California generates the most electricity from geothermal, and that is largely because of our high amount of tectonic activity. So there's a lot of locations that we can use geothermal. And in California, it accounts for almost 6% of our total electricity generation. Another country that uses a lot of geothermal energy is Iceland. And in Iceland, they have been using geothermal power for over 100 years. And the geothermal power plants that make electricity, it makes about 25% of the country's electricity production. And you can see in this picture over here, there really is only 7 states that use geothermal energy. It is California, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, Hawaii, Idaho, and New Mexico in that order from most production to least. So again, geothermal, it isn't used in a lot of places yet, especially because of that restriction on where you can have the power plants. But it is a growing industry. So some pros and cons of geothermal. It has some really good things and some really bad things. One thing that is a really big pro about geothermal is that it is a consistent and really reliable energy source. So it is available all year long, all day long, unlike some other renewable energy sources where they're more intermittent, like solar or wind. And so because of this, it's really easy to predict exactly how much power you're going to get out of that power plant. Which can kind of serve as a baseline and help to know exactly how much energy you're going to need and how much you're going to use. So that is a really big pro of geothermal. It's something that some renewables don't have. Another pro is that it has a relatively small footprint. So it actually uses less land per gigawatt hour of energy produced than a lot of other energy sources, including coal, wind, and solar. So that is definitely a pro. There are some negatives related to geothermal energy, and one of those is that there is sometimes some pollution related to it. So if there are greenhouse gases stored in the earth and we drill into it to get that water and steam from the earth, it will cause some of those greenhouse gases to be released into the atmosphere, as well as a toxic pollutant called hydrogen sulfide. However, this I got from National Geographic, is that geothermal fields produce only 1/6 of the carbon dioxide that a even relatively clean natural gas fueled power plant produces. And these new binary power plants will release essentially no emissions since it is a closed loop and you never have to vaporize that water that you're taking out of the reservoir. Another negative, like I was talking about, is that they're location specific. So it's hard to find places because you can't just have them anywhere in the world. They have to be in tectonically or volcanically active places. Another risk, which is a concern, is that there have been risks associated with geothermal of triggering earthquakes. So because they're used in tectonically active regions, if they have to be drilling into the ground and kind of messing with things, it can sometimes cause a risk of triggering earthquakes. So that is definitely a big concern about geothermal that is being researched more to see really how big of a risk it does cause. But that is obviously at the really big power plants where they're, I'll be talking about it later, but they use a strategy where they're spraying water into the ground to open up fissures. However, these are usually far away from more populous areas, so it could be less of a risk than we might think it would be. And finally, we have to have the water pumped back into the earth to remain sustainable, because if we're just taking the water out of the ground, then obviously it is not a sustainable energy source. But as you saw in all of those geothermal plant diagrams, they're doing that where they will condense the water that they used and send it back into the reservoir. So those are the pros and cons of geothermal. There are definitely some really good things about it, but definitely some bad things about it. And finally, we'll talk about some new developments. So like I've been saying, it is a relatively new technology to create electricity from this geothermal power. So over time, it will be becoming a lot more efficient, and hopefully some of those cons will be researched and try to be alleviated. One of those is already starting to be alleviated, and that is the location-specific part of it. So there is a new technology called enhanced geothermal systems. And as you I have a picture of it over here, and I will explain it a little, but basically it makes it possible to extract that geothermal energy from hot rock that is dry. So it doesn't have to have that reservoir of water or steam. So what they'll do is, one strategy is they will, as you can see in this photo, they'll pump some water down into the ground, which will kind of create its own reservoir. And then that water, once it's heated, will be pushed back up into the power plant, and it does the same thing as a binary power plant. So this way, you don't have to have a reservoir, and you can basically have this be done about anywhere in the world, instead of just in those specific spots where they have a reservoir of hot steam and water. So this is definitely helping that location-specific con of geothermal. Like I said, it can sometimes cause issues with tectonically active places because you're pumping water into the fissures in the ground, which could cause some extra cracks. But this is a new technology in geothermal that is being developed as we go. And that is what I have on geothermal. I will now pass it over to Deanna to talk about solar.
Thank you, Gina. So solar power is energy collected from the sun, and these are photos of photovoltaic systems that we'll later discuss. So solar power is an intermittent form of electricity because there are many factors that affect the availability of sunlight. Some of these factors include the weather, time of day, season, and amount of land available. The best conditions for collecting solar energy are sunny days because clouds can sometimes scatter sunlight, when the time is noon or 12 p.m. because the sun is directly over the earth, when it's summertime because the earth is slightly tilted towards the sun, and having lots of land to be able to collect the solar energy. And right here we have a map of how brightly the sun shines on average in each state. The red areas in the southwest indicate the ideal areas for solar power. So now we'll talk about some of the solar thermal plants. These are more of the utility scale plants that you might see in the desert. And these plants use something called a concentrated thermal collector to focus the sun's energy at a direct point. And this sounds really complicated, and it is, so I'll just give a simplified version. It uses a bunch of mirrors to reflect sunlight to a specific point so that that point becomes extremely hot, and this heat helps produce electricity. On the photo on the top right is called a parabolic trough, and I'm sorry it might be hard to see depending on where you have all your Zoom buddies showing up, but it's a parabolic trough, and this is a type of linear concentrating system. Parabolic troughs use U-shaped mirrors to reflect the sunlight to a point in the very middle of the mirrors. And then the photo on the bottom left is called a solar power tower. These use sun tracking mirrors to reflect sunlight up to the tower. And both of these two systems use a generator to create energy, or electricity, I should say. And then lastly, the photo on the bottom right is called a solar dish. And this one is a little bit different. It uses mirrors that mimic a satellite dish that are able to reflect light into a solar power conversion unit. And these ones don't actually require a generator. And so next we'll talk about photovoltaic systems. A photovoltaic system is comprised of smaller photovoltaic cells, or PV cells for short. PV cells use the sun's light to create an electrical charge, and they are able to create a current from the movement of electrons. We have a diagram here just because it's pretty complicated to explain, and it's honestly a little bit over my head, but hopefully if you're more interested, you could just read this diagram while we're on this slide. These cells are able to be grouped together to power a variety of devices or infrastructure, and they are what you might see on a rooftop or even on your wristwatch or a calculator. This makes them a great option for a variety of uses. So where is this found in the United States? Well, in the US, California produces the most small-scale PV electricity and the most utility-scale solar electricity. And just a reminder, the utility-scale generation is what you'll probably see driving around the desert. And if you kind of think back to when we talked, or when we showed that graph of where the sunlight is most available, you'll see it was in the Southwest. And some of the states in the Southwest are kind of lacking, so there's definitely a lot of room for growth and potential. So now we'll talk about the pros and cons of solar electricity. Some advantages to solar power include their ability to be installed on rooftops and homes and other buildings. This can save people on their utility bills and increase the value of their property, all while having a minimum or minimal impact on the environment. Additionally, solar power does not emit air pollution during operation, unlike non-renewable sources of energy. And then lastly, the Department of Energy estimated over $400 billion in savings if 27% of the United States' total energy consumption is solar powered by 2050. This enormous amount of savings is in part due to the decreased pollution associated with solar power. Less pollution in our atmosphere can increase public health benefits while decreasing our carbon footprint. But sadly, nothing in life is perfect, and some of the downsides to solar power include significant habitat loss and modification. These issues usually arise with utility-scale solar thermal plants because of the amount of land that their mirrors require. Also, the energy collected at these sites must be transported hundreds of miles to its consumers. Solar thermal plants also pose risks to migrating birds, as the birds might confuse the reflection of light with a pool of water. Speaking of water, solar thermal plants consume large amounts of water, which can be harmful in areas like the desert. Water is needed to clean the plants and is sometimes used to actually create steam in a generator. But as Gina was saying earlier, some operations, I'd say this is like a general thing among a lot of the renewable energy sources. Some operations will actually use different types of liquids that have a lower boiling point. Also, if they use these different liquids, they might be hazardous, which can pose risks to wildlife if a leak were to occur. And then lastly, PV cells are also created with hazardous materials. Some new developments in solar energy is that researchers are investigating more efficient designs for PV cells because the current silicon-based designs are reaching their absorption limits. A startup called, we're probably going to butcher this, perovskites is a new coating technology that is affordable and can significantly increase solar absorption. Insulite is another new technology that aims to increase solar absorption, but instead uses small lenses like the one in the photo right there. It looks pretty cool though. It's less cost effective, but it still gets the job done. And then lastly, researchers at MIT are pushing for carbon emissions to be taxed so that solar electricity will become more desirable and accessible to consumers. And that is all. Thank you.
All right, so now that we've covered all of our different energy sources, we will have a little bit of an overview. And I know that this presentation is a bit longer than the ones we usually have, so we'll try to wrap it up pretty quick for you. Basically, a lot of people ask which renewable energy source is the best. Which one should we invest all into and, have all of our energy come from that? And it really is not the right question to be asking because picking one renewable energy source for our whole nation is really not the answer because as we've shown in this, there are some really good sides to some renewables and some really bad sides to them. So they often have a lot of different pros and cons that will kind of complement each other. And so we'll need all of those different, as many as we can, kind of a lot of different renewable energy sources in order to be able to phase out fossil fuels. And so, like we were showing throughout the presentation, different ones are better in different areas. So in different areas of the nation, we can have different types of energy, like solar, as she was saying, in the Southwest and sunnier areas, and the wind power in more windy areas, like the northern seaboard with offshore wind. So we can have them in different locations. And also we were talking about whether the energy is consistent or whether it's more intermittent. So some of those more consistent energy sources can kind of fill in the gaps that the intermittent sources have. Um, and they can all complement each other in different ways. So we think that we shouldn't have to pick one renewable, but that we can work on developing many of them and that all together they can bring us into this renewable energy future that we are hoping for.